In the deafening silence that accompanies many of the great transformations of our time, some words resonate louder precisely because they are spoken against the grain. This is what happened on January 5th, when Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller, former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, gave an interview to the German newspaper Welt.de that was destined to spark discussion far beyond ecclesiastical boundaries. Not an impromptu intervention, nor an isolated provocation, but a complex reflection that touches the heart of the contemporary crisis, the relationship between morality, power, the state, and technology. According to the Cardinal, in an age that proclaims itself emancipated from any transcendent reference, there remains only one institution capable of speaking about morality without ulterior motives: the Church. Not because it is immune to human limitations, but because it is the guardian of principles that arise not from utility, consensus, or force, but rather from a conception of man that precedes and surpasses any political system. It is a clear distinction which marks an increasingly uncomfortable dividing line in Western public debate. The Cardinal observes how the progressive decline of religion has not produced greater freedom, but rather a void. And voids in history never remain voids for long. In the absence of a shared moral compass, a new type of state is filling the vacant space, no longer limited to the governance of civil order, but increasingly inclined to define what is right, what is wrong, what must be accepted, and what must be excluded. A form of modern omnipotence, which does not present itself as authoritarian, but as inevitable. Miller warns against a central misunderstanding of modernity, the idea of an ideologically neutral state, a neutrality that, in his view, exists only on paper, because a state that claims not to have a vision of humanity ends up, paradoxically, imposing one even more pervasively. When political power establishes which definitions of good are admissible in public space, it does not limit itself to administering. It educates, shapes, and conditions. It is within this framework that the Cardinal's words on a marriage legislation, often isolated and simplified in the media debate, fit. Müller clearly distinguishes between the private sphere and public imposition. A state that claims to be neutral, he argues, should not interfere in the private lives of two people who decide to live together. But for precisely this reason, it should not demand that society as a whole adopt as mandatory a definition of marriage developed by the state apparatus. The problem, therefore, is not tolerance, but the transformation of tolerance into dogma. According to the Cardinal, the contradiction of modernity lies precisely here. What is presented as openness often translates into forced conformity. Those who don't conform are not refuted, but marginalized. Objections aren't answered, they're delegitimized. In this sense, the state's supposed neutrality becomes a tool of cultural pressure, more effective than any explicit censorship. The interview then addresses another topic rarely discussed from a moral perspective: public debt. Müller speaks openly of a responsibility toward future generations, denouncing economic policies that shift the burden of present decisions onto those who have no voice to defend themselves. This isn't a technical issue, but an ethical one. Because a society that consumes its future to maintain immediate balances reveals a vision of humanity reduced to the present. but it is perhaps in the realm of technology that the Cardinal's analysis becomes most disturbing. Müller observes with concern the emergence of a new form of class theory, no longer based on birth or work, but on access to technological and economic power. In this vision, the value of life risks being measured in terms of utility, efficiency, and productivity. This paradigm is in direct conflict with Christian anthropology, which is founded on the intrinsic dignity of every person. Technology, the Cardinal states, is not neutral. It can serve humanity or dominate it, depending on the criteria that guide its use. Without clear ethical boundaries, technical progress ceases to be a tool and becomes an end. And it is here that Müller introduces a reference that is bound to spark discussion, that of Peter Thiel, an American technology entrepreneur and influential figure in the American political landscape. The Cardinal does not dispute entrepreneurial skills or successes, but raises a question of principle, the absence of solid ethical barriers in a worldview that intertwines technology, power, and selection. Thiel, thus, becomes a symbol, not a personal target. The symbol of an elite that imagines the future as a space reserved for the few, while the rest remain expendable variables of the system. The reference to the political area close to Donald Trump is placed within the same symbolic horizon. Not a partisan controversy, but an indication of a cultural context in which the boundary between economic power, technological influence, and political decision-making is becoming increasingly blurred. It is a dynamic that does not concern just one country, but crosses the entire West. In the picture Müller paints, a profound divide emerges. On one side, civil institutions claim a monopoly on moral definition. On the other, a church that, though marginalized, continues to invoke non-negotiable limits. Limits are not imposed to control, but to protect. Because, in the Christian vision, not everything that is possible is also permissible, and not everything that is legal is automatically right. The interview offers no easy solutions or reassuring slogans. Rather, it highlights a tension that is destined to grow. In a world that celebrates the absolute autonomy of man, the idea of an objective morality seems increasingly intolerable. Yet, Müller warns, without a foundation that precedes power, power itself becomes the only criterion. This is perhaps the most controversial aspect of his words. The rejection of the idea that progress automatically equates with good. This position offends contemporary sensibilities, accustomed to equating technical advancement with moral evolution. But history, the Cardinal suggests, tells a different story. It tells us that the most advanced societies can produce the most sophisticated forms of dehumanization. In conclusion, Gerhard Ludwig Müller's intervention is not an act of nostalgia, nor a defense of lost privileges. It is a severe diagnosis pronounced by someone who observes with concern a civilization that, in attempting to free itself from every constraint, risks surrendering to faceless and unaccountable powers. In an age that distrusts strong truths, his voice reopens a question that many would prefer to avoid. Who decides today what is truly human? What do you think? If you liked the video, comment Amen. God bless you.